Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Johnson, and I head up the content program at Worldwide Clinical Trials. I'm serving as your moderator today as we discuss how to use data to identify patients and facilitate registration and study execution. Now let's meet our panelists. First, we have Rachel from Raziel Therapeutics. Hi, Rachel. Do you mind just providing some info about your work at Raziel?
Hi, Lindy. My name is Dr. Rachel Guetta, and I'm the Clinical Trials Manager in Raziel Therapeutics. I have an experience of 10 years in the biotech industry, where my efforts were focused on developing products from proof of concept up to clinical trial stage and execution. Raziel Therapeutics is an Israeli company that successfully develops synthetic molecule that leads to fat necrosis and fat elimination in a local manner. To date, Raziel Therapeutics is focusing on several therapeutic areas. That one of them is indicated to Dercum's disease. Dercum's disease is a very rare disease. Its major characteristic is the accumulation of fat in a form of painful lipomas all over the body that press the nerves. And we are targeting to approve our molecule for the treatment of Dercum's disease patients and to lipomas elimination and pain relief by simple subcutaneous injections into these lipomas.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Next, we have Sam from Datavant. Sam, do you mind just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, happy to, Lindsay. My name is Sam Rose. I'm a co-founder and head up our life sciences group with Datavant. Datavant is a technology company that is focused on providing a privacy-preserving record linkage system for health data. And what that allows our partners to do is to pull many disparate data elements that tell the journey of the patient from diagnosis to intervention to outcome in a more longitudinal and holistic manner, to pull together those many various data points that each tell a small part of the story and to provide a means to jointly query those to inform both improvements in care delivery as well as opportunities to accelerate the pace of clinical development programs. So excited to participate in this discussion today, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Thanks, Sam. And then finally, we have Dr. Michael Murphy from Worldwide Clinical Trials. Dr. Murphy, do you mind just introducing yourself a little bit?
Yes, my name is Mike Murphy. I'm Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for the company. My particular areas of interest are in strategic program design and protocol evaluation and design. We are a full-service CRO. We tend to specialize in 4 major therapeutic areas, but relevant to our conversation today is our interest in orphan diseases and applying innovative solutions to those unique problems.
Thank you. Welcome, all of you, and we're just going to get right into our first discussion point. What are the major challenges for sponsors developing orphan drugs? For example, is it finding patients with established diagnoses or finding patients who may have a diagnosis that have not yet been correctly formulated?
We have difficulties in finding enough patients for our proposed studies. The difficulty is in the number of patients required in order to achieve statistically significant results, but also there is a challenge in finding patients with correct diagnosis. For some of the more unusual conditions where we have clinical development programs, it is very easy for a physician to miscategorize a patient, even when by all accounts the patient will have the disease in question. So in answer to your question, it's all of the above: finding patients with the correct diagnosis, and finding patients who are interested in participating in interventional or observational trials.
Rachel spoke to the points quite well. I think that there's a number of challenges that are facing those that are developing for rare disease. In those cases where there is an established diagnosis, in many instances, patients are going to exist 1 or 2 at a site at a given time. Unfortunately, given the low prevalence of these diseases, many clinicians are not able to quickly recognize the signature patterns of these diseases in routine clinical care, and many of them go misdiagnosed out in the wild. So one of the core challenges is both finding these patients where they are diagnosed, but then also finding the patients even when their own HCPs might have missed them on the first go around.
The challenge that a contract research organization will have, frankly, begins with the design of the study and extends into the operational aspects. So, although it is possible for us with sufficiently diligent review of the literature to have a pretty good understanding of the disease presentation without having access to the patient journey, the patient narrative, so to speak, we don't really fully appreciate the illness can be quite different across patients. And it is that subtle distinction, frankly, that makes a difference between a protocol that we think is informative and a protocol that's informative plus feasible. So by illness, by the way, I mean the family and the patient's experiences with the disease and how that might shape a willingness to participate in a trial. So additionally, because diagnostics can be uncertain in the absence of a molecular diagnosis, our eligibility criteria need to be mapped against our feasibility for the study. Otherwise, we cannot generate the metrics, which directly impact patient accrual, potential patient retention, and the data substrate that we need, of course, to engage services. Finally, although we can get some insights from patient advocacy groups, and we routinely engage these groups at the earliest stages of a program, is good, without having detailed and granular depiction of patient journey, such as what might be provided by Datavant, and how that patient crosses through what I call the last mile to the investigator, we're going to be limited. So within the orphan disease space, this issue above many others dominates and is of supreme importance to most sponsors and to most of our services. And patient mapping is routinely a requested service.
Now that we've highlighted some of the challenges and limitations of orphan disease research, have any of you considered the opportunities that might be associated with the use of observational studies and large data sets to identify patients of interest and refer them to test centers? Is it possible that this technique has been overemphasized within the literature, though, and that the results do not often match the investment?
Our approach has been very traditional. We begin with finding qualified investigators, and then we depend upon these investigators to identify patients and consider these patients for participation in our studies. We have to date no access databases in order to refine our search, because generally for many orphan diseases, either the databases do not exist or that they exist with inadequate detail to permit patient identification. We are familiar with the literature suggesting that the use of registries as an example for patient identification and recruitment might be a novel way to proceed, but like many other sponsors, we are not familiar with the practical aspects of that type of an approach, although we are curious as to how that might be implemented. Actually, what has been your experience?
The challenge that we're speaking to here is one of those that I'm most excited about working on at Datavant. And really, as Rachel quite perfectly characterized it, much of what we're dealing with here is a data problem where the current sources of data that are available to industry in identifying these patients and getting them enrolled into a study are quite limited. Where they are available, they tell only a small snapshot of the broader journey of that patient. And in many ways, it's quite similar to the parable of the blind man and the elephant, where each man is touching a different part of the elephant and is characterizing a wildly different picture of what the elephant is by virtue of the limited purview that they have into the whole of that elephant. And the reality is that for many of these rare diseases, you need to have a holistic picture in order to differentiate these patients that have these conditions from the background noise and from other diagnoses that look quite similar. And so that's where we've supported some CROs and sponsors in tackling this problem of bringing together the disparate data elements that tell that journey of a patient and start to create a foundation on which models can be built that can suggest what is that differentiating clinical signature of the disease. Where are these patients manifesting in terms of region or site? What are the best ways to engage with these patients? Where they are diagnosed, what are the areas where the patients might be being misdiagnosed? What are the opportunities for additional education or deployment of medical science liaisons in order to ensure that these patients are getting the right care for their disease in question. And so I think that as we look at the field today, there's a tremendous amount of siloing of these data that are useful. And our hope is that as more of these data sets are brought together and put in the hands of researchers that are working in the rare disease space, that ultimately that will lead to faster recruiting studies as well as more patients that are properly diagnosed. But to the point that you raised about to what extent is this overblown or what are the potential caveats, I think that there needs to be a set of conditions that need to apply for this data-driven approach to make sense. One of the key ones is that there needs to be some type of differentiating clinical signature that can be observed in these real-world data. And so for some diseases, there's well-known signatures of the disease that are characterized within the literature. In others, it might require new analytical approaches that look at a broader journey of the patient and more sophisticated analytical techniques to find those patients. And in some instances, in the available real-world data, there might not be that differentiating clinical signature. And so for every trial and every program is unique and ultimately will require an approach that is tailored to that specific patient population and natural history of the disease as we understand it.
It's the data and it's the analytics. You know, it's possible to find a patient with a formal diagnosis, as an example, but in the orphan disease space where we frequently work, sometimes a formal diagnosis does not exist. And so we're interested in algorithms, perhaps Bayesian approaches and other devices, which would cluster signs and symptoms likely associated with the disease. And so it's an analytical challenge as well as a data access issue. And those data mining capabilities are very attractive to us, and they're very frequently touted. We have not had enough experience to indicate whether the return on investment is there, but it is certainly the wave of the future vis-a-vis patient identification. So part of the problems also, from my perspective, seems to be around management of privacy issues. You know, once we identify, say, an anonymous patient, getting that patient, as I like to say, to the last mile before the investigative site, seems to raise some unique problems in terms of protecting data integrity and data privacy, but it's part of the challenges of moving forward. So this particular topic, though, as Sam has indicated, I'd have to say is one of the major themes out there today, particularly as we attempt to evaluate more refined patient phenotypes who don't fit into well-defined diagnostic categories.
Building off of that, I would love to discuss whether any of you have considered the use of observational data to better define the patient journey a little more. So, for example, using publicly accessible data to identify patterns of use, transitions in care that classically precedes a current diagnosis. How might those types of data facilitate your development and commercialization program?
We appreciate that there is an interest in identifying the type of medical care that patients, especially with rare diseases, might receive before they receive correct diagnosis. Additionally, we are aware of the need to examine the utilization of healthcare on the pathway to the diagnosis, and particularly once the diagnosis actually occurs, it is our understanding that this information can be used to inform decisions regarding the pricing, placement on formularies, and reimbursement of patients. What has been the experience of Worldwide and the team in that regard? Also, when should this effort begin?
Speaking for Worldwide, I can say that we think this is incredibly valuable. For commercialization purposes, the type of data we're alluding to are invaluable to inform the type of outcomes versus measures. We want to know what the outcomes are, not only what the measures would be, that need to be accessed. They help identify subgroups for us of individuals within any given indication who have those comorbidities and other disease features likely to be most important in terms of healthcare utilization. You know, there's the old adage that 10% of the sample drives 90% of the healthcare expenditures. So observational data would help us define that extremely well, and we need to know it early and not late. The current trend is to start considering these issues very early in development, sometimes even pre-IND, contingent upon the indication and the pharmacotherapy, and to understand better the whole panoply of different services that a patient might receive, such as physical therapy, respiratory therapy, and other types of activity, which would be part of the overall service profile for these patients. We need to accommodate these in our experimental design. So we need it early before we run studies. Otherwise, we cannot incorporate them into the studies for measurement. So indeed, the more innovative the therapy and the more breakthrough it is in quality, the more it is imperative to consider this very early in the program so that they could be introduced, measured, and analyzed before the time of registration. So from our point of view, it's a great topic. We see things as, bad enough to get the approval. That's always difficult. Difficult occasionally get the adoption, but really important to get patient access. We build upon the theme that, if I build it, would anyone actually come? So the observational data help inform a typical registration program so that we can satisfy really very diverse interests of many different stakeholders.
To the points that Mike and Rachel just raised, I think that there's a tremendous amount of value of leveraging this observational data really across the full life cycle of not just clinical development, but also the commercialization. Creating a strong picture of the natural history of these patients, of course, as we mentioned before, can help with recruiting a study quickly and designing a protocol that is going to be feasible and get the right data substrate to support a strong case for that asset's approval. But also, as those very same models can be deployed once the asset is on market, both to support the post-market requirements that often come, especially with some of these, especially novel approaches and targets to treating these orphan diseases, particularly as we're seeing the rise of things like gene therapy, where there's a interest in tracking these patients in a long-term longitudinal view in order to track those long-term outcomes for both safety and efficacy. That becomes a requirement to then pull in a stronger platform for bringing in those observational results. And as Mike also alluded to, as we're transitioning into an environment where questions of whether a medication actually reaches the patient go beyond safety and efficacy, but also come into value. Those very same data sets and analytical pipelines that were leveraged to build that body of evidence and design that protocol that got the asset approved can similarly be leveraged then to build a value story for that same asset, looking at patients that have received that intervention and tracking their outcomes in order to build a story for market access. So I think that what we're seeing here is something of a kind of virtuous cycle of the ways with better use of real world data and analytics, it lifts up the opportunities at really each phase of these assets life cycle.
Well, Sam, you said an interesting thing there. So most organizations concerned with providing patient access in an era of really constrained resources. The general expression we hear is, I want you to compete on the value of it, not on the novelty of the intervention. So competing on value, as you've alluded to, is really essential, and that needs to be incorporated very early into the clinical development program. That unique perspective. Not does it work with some measure that might be specific to the disease, but does it actually materially change an outcome in the patient or, interestingly, in their family?
Now, we're going to switch gears a little bit and discuss about regulatory guidance. So are you all aware of the recent regulatory guidance providing new possibilities for the use of observational data? An example of this is the external controls, such as historical data, which would reduce the need for concurrent controls within interventional studies. The technique might maximize the number of patients on active treatment while minimizing the number of patients on placebo. Our impression is that it has created considerable excitement in the community. Some may argue that the enthusiasm is premature, that the basic analytic approaches to these data have yet to be defined. What has been your reaction to these developments?
We are aware of recent regulatory pronouncements suggested that control groups might be created from data that is not technically contained within a protocol, for example, from historical information. If this were implemented, it would needed be very exciting for all stakeholders, that fewer patients would receive standards of care, more patients would receive an interventional product. However, it's our impression that this type of initiative initiative in its infancy is not fully developed and less frequently employed for studies that have registration intent, for example, for potentially pivotal trials. Other than for exploratory studies, does Worldwide see a role this type of initiative?
Well, speaking for Worldwide, we're really excited about this possibility. If you're a trialist, if you're a methodologist, you can't help but be intrigued by this possibility. But our experience has been very cautious, just as you've suggested. And in part, it's because the granularity of the data that exists in these different options for creating an external control, the granularity is often absent. So what we do is, and this topic comes up actually quite frequently, can we do something like a pre versus post design or a before after design? Can we reduce the number of patients on control by augmenting it with these types of data and therefore maximize the number of individuals on product? Very exciting. But again, the amount of data available to do that in some respects seems very limited. So what we do as a preliminary step is we launch a retrospective chart review looking at, let's say, representative patients. We particularly like to go in what I call integrated delivery networks, where all caregiver, patient, physician transactions are usually commonly available through electronic medical records. The chart review, frankly, can help us determine whether, in principle, routine clinical care for that particular indication could be sufficiently detailed to help inform something like an external control. So where we've landed on this recently, acknowledging it's a big topic, it's a very exciting idea. It really in principle, maximizes the number of patients on drug. And when you have a desperate disease, that's so important to do. But the linchpin ultimately will be in how the data are accessible and whether or not they're useful in any form, such as for matching purposes. So clinical care data, for the purposes of this question, given our experience, simply is not sufficiently dense nor broad in its application to enable the types of experimental design which are implied by these new regulations, but in its kind of infancy. What we have been doing, just to finish on this note, is we have been launching prospective observational studies in which we structure the collection of different measures for the purposes of informing such a design. We create a study to sample with sufficient detail and range of assessments all the different measures that might exist in these patients, and then in some respects that might be used at least as an exploratory type of analysis. This does not in any way minimize the importance of the available large data that Sam and team access, which would inform healthcare decisions. That's still great, but it does put a qualifying comment on using these types of data. That's say for the type of regulatory sanction protocols that might lead to product approval.
I think you're spot on. There's tremendous potential for leveraging these data sets as a part of a registrational study, especially as part of an external comparator. And when we think about that promise, really what it is it's taking all of those small little experiments where the N equals 1, where that represent every real world patient's journey and that progression from diagnosis to intervention to outcome, and assembling those together in a way that they can support the care of the next patient and to serve as a comparator instead of needing to enroll a patient that would be put onto standard of care. But as you've noted, there's a number of things that need to be true in order for that to be useful. And I think that we're very much in our infancy as an industry of making use of that real world evidence. We have the benefit of having one of the most receptive regulatory audiences that I think that we as an industry have seen in quite some time, and with both the combination of 21st century cures here in the United States, as well as many at FDA that are quite active and engaged in looking to bring more real world data into these development programs. I think that we are going to see an expanding domain of where these data can be brought to bear. But today it's in those places where, as Mike described, that the richness of the real world data is sufficient to serve as a sufficient comparator to the data that is collected through these traditional methods within a clinical trial. And it's also important to note that many of these data are inherently messy in the real world. The nature of data entry and data capture in a clinic for routine clinical care is quite different than what it is in a clinical trial setting. And so what we as an industry need are a path of data curation, of statistical models that take into account that noise around these real-world data sets and seek to quantify it. And I think as the initial places where we've seen real-world evidence deployed are instances where running a traditional comparator is either unethical or infeasible, or in those instances where the expected treatment effect is so high as it can overpower the noise that may exist within a real-world data set. And so we've seen some experience and use of these data today in the generation of submissible evidence. And I think that as the tools and the richness of the data continue to expand and mature, we'll see these real-world data sets be deployed in more and more places around the industry.
That's fantastic, Sam. You mentioned that every single physician-patient transaction is basically a single-case experimental design. And our ability to access that and use the data to inform our programs would be a phenomenal accomplishment. And maybe we're on the brink of doing that now.
I think you've all highlighted a lot of great points. Now, are you aware of companies in the orphan space who are encountering significant barriers to the placement of their product on formularies with adequate levels of reimbursement? Our impression is this is a common theme in orphan development programs, and that increasing use of real-world data mining could substantially facilitate commercialization as it establishes a pattern of healthcare utilization. Should this be part of the strategic program, or better deferred until once product registration has been achieved?
Many conventions and sessions and at international meetings in the orphan space dedicate a significant proportion of the discussion to this topic. So we appreciate that the approval of a drug might not be associated with a successful commercialization unless we present data that would be useful for a wide variety of different payers. So has Worldwide had experience with using data mining techniques? And if yes, what is the optimal time for starting that discussion? What can sponsors do primitively?
Oh, well, earlier is best. Many companies, even pre-IND, have been through that experience many times. So just to highlight what you've said, at least I always say a third of any orphan disease meeting in particular is on discussions about, if we get it approved, how do we secure access? How do we promote the access of the product? And of course, our audience for those data are payers, but they're a very diverse lot, particularly in the United States, but additional complexity within the EU, ranging from government sponsors programs through commercial plans, through self-insured employers are all quite different. So what is absolutely seminal to one company is less important to another. It kind of, reinforces my impression that if you have spoken to one payer, you've simply spoken to one payer. So first principles for us, we acknowledge the issue, and we acknowledge that we need to do a payer survey as early as possible to understand what the data needs would actually need to be. So surprisingly, frequently in the same room, you'll have a tremendous interest. It's definitely of concern. They have very pointed views as to what type of information would be required. And in the same room, other people not even on the radar screen. So this kind of approach to get a payer survey first is key. The way you might think of it is that the CRO is really very good at answering questions, but we have to know what the questions are. And by having a payer survey so we can see what the payer sentiments are, we can appropriately tailor how we approach the problem, what the mix would be, say, of real-world data versus classic interventional studies. It's really quite a collage of different solutions, but begins very early in the program. As we're attempting to develop evidence of efficacy and safety, again, as we've said previously, we're attempting to create a database that speaks to the value of the product. And Sam, how does your company be contributory in that regard? I know you have many experiences there.
You and Rachel covered many of these points quite well, that really it's incumbent to look at these programs not just as next step immediately in front of you, but rather as a life cycle that is being managed. And so as you're initiating that process of data collection, you need to think not just about the regulatory constituencies that are going to be reviewing that data, but also the payers that are going to be evaluating the value that your asset brings relative to the other treatment options. Innovative therapy goes nowhere if it's not accessible to patients. So I think that to your point, where we support in this type of work is both in providing a path to bridge in here in the United States in particular claims data on top of traditional clinical trial data to support in delivering on those long-term outcomes for audiences that are interested in doing extended observations or reviewing the path of the patients after a study window closes. And for on-market assets, one of the core challenges, as we discussed before with identifying these rare disease patients, is that a ICD-10 code is often insufficient to define the patient population that you want to track and to create data for. And so through linking different data sets creates the ability to define that population in a way that matches the label for the asset and creates a more refined approach to showcasing the value of that intervention.
I can almost see a three-dimensionality about it, Sam. You're creating a very rich profile of a given patient by the way you link the data sets together. From our point of view, it's an amazingly complex environment, and when we design studies, I always say what we're actually doing is adjudicating the conflicting interest occasionally of multiple stakeholders. So the process of designing a program is about accommodating all of these diverse interests, and your particular technology lends itself to that beautifully, it seems.
We all know that collecting and using the right data is vital to a study, but now once we have the correct data, we have to create a plan to use it effectively in a trial. Do you mind sharing what the next steps would be now that we have the right data?
Well, speaking for the CRO, our particular interest is to, I call it, accommodate what the data are trying to tell us. So again, it's about outcomes, not measures. It's about whether they're short or longer term, and it's about trying to estimate how we might approach that through a program of a design. So simple things occasionally quite useful. We might, for example, wish to execute the study in a network like an integrated delivery network, Kaiser Permanente, Geisinger Clinic, and so forth. Again, where we have access to all of the healthcare transactions that patient has undergone. That might be a simple solution. Where we could then, in addition to running the interventional study, we can do some additional observational analyses on the data which are available. The second thing we would do, and this is interesting because it's usually overlooked, is start building a literature base for the indication. It's amazing how many times a sponsor will present, say, a product for consideration from a view of a payer when there's no literature. We don't know the illness. We don't know the manifestations of it. We don't know how it drives expenditures and utilization. So starting to create a dossier of information that provides a substrate upon which we can judge the value of the product is really, critically important. Then, of course, we have to start collecting the outcomes. Now, it is frequently the case that the individuals responsible for giving you your primary and secondary variables are not going to be as enthused, so to speak, about gathering data on healthcare utilization. Nevertheless, we do attempt to piggyback that information on top of a registration study, recognizing the inherent artificiality of that approach. After all, these are not the representative sites, these are the best sites. These are not representative patients, they are the best patients. But nevertheless, it is very, very informative and part of the overall solution matrix we're trying to put together. That's how we would begin if we had the information at hand. We would start designing and incorporating that into our prospective studies. We bring in our colleagues who specialize in observational research to see whether or not additional opportunities are available with either a retrospective chart review, a longitudinal cohort study, something like that. And then what we're trying to converge toward is a point in time when all of that information comes together. And then we can position the compound for people that dictate whether or not it's on formulary, whether or not it's reimbursed, and whether or not it's reimbursed at a level commensurate with the amount of effort that went into creating it.
After the data is assembled, where there might be upon the initial analysis where there's a recognition that more data might be valuable, one of the things that we can support our partners with is, as there's a particular population defined and there's an interest in pulling in additional data points for that population, one of the things that we can support is essentially creating a Venn diagram study between that population you already have and data that sits at an external source. So through that, if you are doing that analysis and you recognize that you may be missing a particular insight that might be useful for answering the question at hand, there's an opportunity to go back to the well, find some additional data, and bring that in to further characterize that population in a way that might fill some gaps on the data that you already hold.
To emphasize a point I mentioned earlier, perhaps the most difficult thing is to have a CRO plan their operations around what I call centers of influence. I think there's an increasing trend, and particularly in orphan diseases, for single centers to have a tremendous influence on how medicine might be practiced and how products might be utilized. So it's not so much a dispersed model. It's actually just a few select centers that would actually drive how the product ultimately is used. We need to have our prototypical registration program placed in those centers, along with accessing all the other data we alluded to. The expression we use, particularly in the United States, would be, don't send me a model, send me my data. So placing studies, interventional trials in centers of excellence, I think is increasingly important in order to inform the overall desirability of the program. As I said earlier, none of us actually in CRO really know everything about the 7,000 orphan diseases, as an example, that are out there. We can read a lot about them, but it doesn't tell us about the heterogeneity really that presents. So by having these types of data, it helps inform how we design the study. A typical sentiment might be expressed by a family member that I spoke to not so long ago who had a child with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. He said, you know, Dr. Murphy, I live 200 miles away from the clinic. So if you design a study that has a frequent visit structure, I've got to drive 200 miles. Making it worse would be if you demand that we have fasting labs on the day that I arrive in the clinic, and really making it worse if you demand that my child go through a number of complex procedures and maneuvers to show performance. She said, I have to tell you, you're not going to get very good data if you do that. So those initial conversations with caregivers are very helpful to us. Having access to real-world data would help inform our design in really quite meaningful ways. Again, as I mentioned earlier, so that the design is not only informative, but it's actually feasible, and it samples a group of patients who are representative of the overall number of patients who are out there.
Let's talk successes a little bit. Have any of you had success when it comes to using this type of data for helping with study execution?
Well, the short answer is it depends on the level of its use. I've had a great deal of success using claims data as a good anecdote in Fragile X syndrome. So I am a journal editor that deals with this topic quite frequently, not how to get drugs approved, but how to get them access. And so I noticed the sponsor had submitted an article for a claims-based analysis in Fragile X syndrome. And as I read through the article, I was acutely aware that the data needs for commercial plans and for government programs are actually quite different, and that we would have to accommodate that difference when we executed the program. There's also been other companies that have very effectively used these types of data, as you know, to position a product for registration. Not without controversy at times, but what's fascinating is the possibility of doing it. So I think it's an emerging trend. It's not fully articulated. It's a bit overpromised and underdelivered, as I would say, but it does represent, I think, an exciting possibility, not only for orphan diseases where you would naturally think it's more applicable, but other types of programs as well. As we, amongst ourselves, we say, the people that we enroll in even prototypical phase 3 programs are largely fully representative of those that actually receive the treatment. And that's because by definition, people who actually receive the treatment maybe didn't volunteer for the study. So this notion of enhancing generalizability in the data set is a really important one. The later we are in development, the more important that becomes. And the real world data helps inform what these different patient data sets need to look at. And importantly, whether or not there are any subgroups in there that are really driving much of the concern medically. People with significant comorbidities, concomitant medications. As I like to half joke in my colleagues who work in this area, the people that we systematically exclude from most of our studies in order to enhance signal detection. So we want to know who those people are. We want to include them in our program at an appropriate point in time. And the real world data, including information such as what DataVant could provide, would help us design the program effectively.
Mike characterized it well, which is when I think about the different areas in which data can play, there are exercises in trial optimization and feasibility of ensuring that the protocol is suited to the patients that you want to recruit, the data that you want to collect, and that it will support a rapid accrual. There's the exercises of pulling in data as part of submissible evidence that we've spoken to earlier in this conversation. And then there is leveraging data to support with post-marketing requirements, as well as some of to support those market access use cases that we've spoken to a bit earlier. So across each of those, we've seen our partners realize considerable value from bringing these data sets to bear. I think to the conversation we want to recruit, identify where they're receiving care, to identify the best engagement approaches for them, to develop protocols that are going to recruit them rapidly, and then on the late phase work of supporting observational studies and building that value story to take to payers in the real world, characterizing the performance of a given asset. So I think that we're already seeing data at work in large number of places today, and quite excited over the next several years to see the ways in which the industry further matures the use of these data and ultimately accelerates the pace of healthcare innovation.
Yeah, the way we say that, Sam, is, I need to know who the patients are in the deep end of the swimming pool. People that have the complexities that actually drive the utilization. That's the key for us, because ordinarily we would not necessarily enroll them in a study because it could degrade signal detection. I also would like to know how physicians would likely use the product, not the way you designed the study, but in reality, once it's on the market, what is the pattern of use out there? Will it be some combination of polypharmacy, which is really so frequently observed? Would also like to know the non-pharmacological therapy that's important to particular patients. I mentioned physical therapy, rehabilitation medicine, because the question I have there is, does the intervention facilitate that or does it degrade it? I call it an interaction effect. So, and finally, I need to know prospectively, what are the types of gaps in information that's likely to exist? Much less what is a disease? What are the patient narratives around that disease? So we can sample patients appropriately at different stages of the program. So it is of immense value to know this when we're designing the program, to anticipate what the data likely would look like, where we need to go to gather the data, how the analyses might be approached, so that in addition, as I like to say, to getting the product approved, we can also enhance adoption and patient access. So very much from a CRO's perspective is how do we incorporate that into our program.
I think we have time for one more question. And I wanted to ask you all, how can we think ahead and start using this data throughout the entire clinical trial process? How can we start planning and really getting the most out of it?
Well, I can give you a CRO's point of view, and it requires a different way of thinking. It requires a strategic view of the assignment and not a transactional view. The goal is not to run a particular trial, it's run a particular study that informs an overall strategy of development. So first rule is think strategically and not just transactionally. Think in terms of the overall program and not a specific study. Integrate your team with the team of the sponsor so that as an extended group, such as the folks at Datavant, create a matrix where people come to the table with different skills, different orientations, and work in a very collegial and cooperative fashion to produce an integrated data platform upon which the drug can be approved and also accessible. I would say that's the biggest challenge we have currently in R&D, as occasionally we do see a lack of a strategic investment on the part of all of the vendors who are involved.
Yeah, I think at the first step comes with the realization that data is one size fits all. And it's incumbent upon the CRO and the sponsor to define what data is truly going to be fit for the purpose for which they desire to deploy it. So there's many different types of data and with different characteristics in terms of their richness, their latency, their coverage of a given population. And so the right data is going to be informed by the question. And so what I always say to our partners who are at the start of the program and are looking for ways to deploy data more effectively within it, it first starts with answering the question of what are the insights that you want to glean from these real world data sets. And then ultimately that will then define the Lego pieces that are to be assembled together to create a custom and bespoke data asset that brings together the right elements from different places to support that particular program and the questions that the sponsor wants to answer.
It's a wonderful time to be in research and development. I have rarely seen the technology so sophisticated. It's really quite remarkable. Clinical targets so highly nuanced, you see. And as I like to say, no one's developing the 10th ACE inhibitor. So it does require the coordinated effort of a lot of different people, sponsors, organizations like DataVan who give us exciting new tools to use, and a CRO that has a visionary perspective on product development who thinks through the issues very early and tries to accommodate those perspectives as they roll out a planned program.
Couldn't agree more. It is definitely a great time to be in clinical research. So with that, I want to thank you all for attending today and giving some excellent insights on the topics. And for all the listeners, if you have a topic you want to learn more about and have some uncommon conversations around, please feel free to email me at lindsay.johnson@worldwide.com. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.